Imagine being locked inside a prison where no one knows your fate. No trial, no clear justice, just waiting in silence. This is the real story of Missouri's guerrilla prisoners. Stay with me, because what happened next will shock you. The prison door slammed shut. The sound echoed through the stone hallway like a warning. Inside the dim cell, a young man in torn clothes sat on the cold floor, his hands bound in iron chains. Just days before, he had been riding fast through the Missouri countryside, part of a guerrilla group feared by soldiers and civilians alike. Now he was a prisoner. Outside, Union guards stood watch, rifles ready. They knew who they were holding. These were not ordinary soldiers. These were bushwhackers. Men accused of raids, ambushes, and acts of terror during the Civil War. Some said they were fighters for a cause. Others called them criminals. And now, many of them were locked inside military prisons across Missouri. The air inside the cell was heavy. No one spoke. No one moved. Because they all knew what could come next. Interrogation, punishment, or even execution. One guard stopped in front of the cell and stared in. His voice was low but firm. "You won't be riding free again." The prisoner looked up slowly, but before he could answer, footsteps rushed down the hallway, a door opened, and a new order was shouted. Something had changed, something serious, and whatever it was about to decide who lived and who would never leave that prison alive. The story didn't begin in the prison. It began outside, in the fields, forests, and small towns of Missouri. During the American Civil War, Missouri was not like other states. It was divided, neighbor against neighbor, friend against friend. Some supported the Union, others supported the Confederacy, and in between them were men who chose a different path, guerrilla fighters. They did not wear full uniforms. They did not fight in open battle lines. They attacked suddenly, then disappeared. These fighters became known as bushwhackers. One of the most feared leaders among them was William Quantrill. Quantrill led a group of men who carried out fast and deadly raids. They moved quickly on horseback. They struck towns and supply lines, then vanished before soldiers could catch them. Their actions made them powerful, but also dangerous, because they did not always follow the rules of war. In response, Union forces became more aggressive. They hunted guerrilla fighters across Missouri. They arrested anyone suspected of helping them, and when they captured bushwhackers, they did not treat them like regular soldiers. They were placed in military prisons, tightly guarded, closely watched, because officials feared these men could escape or inspire more violence. Inside those prisons, life was harsh. Cells were small, food was limited, guards were strict. The prisoners were kept isolated to prevent communication. Some were questioned for hours. Others waited in silence, unsure of their fate. Were they prisoners of war or criminals? That question had no clear answer. And because of that, their treatment varied. Some prisoners were held for months, others for years, and some never made it out alive. One of the most shocking events connected to these prisoners happened in 1863. Union authorities arrested several young women suspected of helping guerrilla fighters. Some were relatives of bushwhackers. Others were believed to be messengers. They were taken to a makeshift prison building in Kansas City. But the building was not strong. The structure had been damaged before. Still, the prisoners were kept inside. Days passed. Tension grew. Then suddenly, the building collapsed. Walls fell. Dust filled the air. Screams echoed through the streets. Several prisoners were killed. Others were badly injured. The news spread quickly. When guerrilla fighters heard what had happened, anger filled them. Among those who reacted was William Quantrill. He blamed Union forces for the collapse, and he decided to strike back, not with words, but with violence. In August 1863, Quantrill and his men rode into Lawrence, Kansas. What followed became one of the most infamous events of the Civil War, the Lawrence Massacre. The attack shocked the nation, and it made one thing clear: the line between soldier and outlaw had completely disappeared. After that, Union forces increased their efforts. They arrested more guerrilla fighters, they tightened prison security, and they made it clear anyone connected to these attacks would face serious consequences. Back inside the prison, the captured bushwhackers felt the change. Guards became stricter, punishments became harsher, the mood grew darker. Because now, this was no longer just about holding prisoners. It was about control, fear, and stopping the violence at any cost. The young prisoner sitting in the cell could feel it: the silence, the tension, the uncertainty. He didn't know what would happen next, but he knew one thing for sure: the war outside had followed him inside. And in this place, there were no clear rules, no clear justice, only waiting for a decision that could end his life. As footsteps approached again down the hallway, the prisoners looked up. The guards stopped at the cell door. Keys rattled, the lock turned, and the door slowly opened. "Get up," the guard said. The prisoner stood, chains clinked, heart racing, because this moment, this next step, could lead to freedom or something far worse. And as he was led out of the cell, deeper into the prison, he realized something chilling. Not everyone who walked down that hallway ever came back. Stay with the story, because what happened next inside those prison walls would reveal just how far the war had gone and how dangerous these prisoners truly were.
The door slammed shut behind him again, but this time it was not a cell. It was a room. Dark, quiet, empty. The young prisoner stood still, his chains heavy on his wrists. A single lantern flickered on a wooden table. Shadows moved along the walls like they were alive. Then a voice spoke from the darkness. "Tell us where they are." Two Union officers stepped forward. Their faces were serious. Their eyes never left him. They were not asking questions for no reason. They wanted names, locations, plans, because outside those prison walls, the war was still burning and the bushwhackers were still out there. The prisoner said nothing. Seconds felt like minutes. Minutes felt like hours. One officer leaned closer. "You rode with them," he said. "We know that." Still silence. The cause was clear. Union forces needed information. The action was pressure, and the consequence, a moment that could decide everything. The officer stepped back slowly. Then he gave a quiet order. The guard moved forward. The chains tightened, and the prisoner realized this was not just a prison. It was a place where silence could cost you everything. Life inside these military prisons was not simple. It was not calm. It was not fair in the way people might expect today. Because these prisoners were not seen as regular soldiers. They were guerrilla fighters, bushwhackers, men who attacked without warning and disappeared into forests and towns. Union officers believed these fighters made the war more dangerous, more unpredictable. So when they were captured, the rules changed. Inside prisons across Missouri, conditions became stricter. Cells were crowded. Some prisoners slept on hard floors. Food was basic: bread, water, sometimes thin soup, nothing more. No comfort, no peace. Guards watched them closely at all times, and communication between prisoners was often forbidden because the government feared one thing: that these men could still organize even from inside prison. One of the places where many guerrilla prisoners were held was the Gratiot Street Prison. From the outside, it looked like a strong building: tall walls, heavy doors, guards always present. But inside, it was a different world. Dark hallways, small cells, the sound of chains and footsteps echoing day and night. Prisoners there came from different backgrounds. Some were young, some were older. Some had joined guerrilla groups for belief, others for survival, and some simply because the war had pulled them in. Among the names whispered inside prison walls was William Quantrill. Even though Quantrill himself was not always captured, many of his fighters were, and their connection to him made them targets for strict treatment, because his raids had caused fear across the region, especially after the attack on Lawrence, Kansas. That event changed everything. After that, Union forces believed stronger action was needed. So inside the prisons, discipline became even harsher. Punishments were used to keep control. If a prisoner refused orders, he could be placed in isolation, a dark cell, no light, no sound, only time and silence. Some prisoners broke under that pressure. Others held on, day by day, night by night, waiting, hoping, not knowing what would come next. Outside the prison walls, the war continued. Missouri remained one of the most dangerous places in the country. Guerrilla fighters still moved through the countryside. Union soldiers still hunted them, and civilians lived in fear of both sides. Because in this kind of war, there were no safe places, and that fear reached into the prisons too. Because guards knew some of these prisoners were not ordinary men. They had escaped before. They had fought in ways others did not, so security stayed tight. Doors locked, chains checked, every movement watched. Back in the interrogation room, the young prisoner finally spoke, but not loudly, just enough to be heard. "I won't say anything." The officer stared at him, no anger, just a cold, steady look. Then he nodded once. The guard stepped forward again, chains pulled tighter. The prisoner was turned around and led back into the hallway, step by step, past other closed doors, past other silent cells, each one holding someone waiting for their own moment, their own fate. As he walked, he heard something, a voice, faint from another cell, then another, whispers, names, warnings. The prisoners were finding ways to communicate after all, even in silence, even under watch, because survival was not just about strength, it was about connection, about knowing you were not alone, and that gave them something powerful, hope. But hope inside a prison like this was dangerous because it could be taken away at any moment. As the prisoner was pushed back into his cell, the door slammed shut once again. Darkness returned. Silence followed. But something had changed. He now understood the truth. This prison was not just holding bodies, it was trying to break minds. And not everyone would survive that. Days passed, then weeks. Some prisoners were moved, others disappeared. Rumors spread quickly. Some said men were being transferred, others said they were being executed. No one knew for sure, and that uncertainty became its own kind of punishment. One night, the hallway filled with noise, boots, voices, keys. The prisoners woke instantly, listening, waiting. A guard stopped at one of the cells, not his, but close. The lock turned. The door opened. "Come out." A man stepped forward slowly, chains dragging. The door shut behind him. Footsteps faded, and then nothing. No return, no explanation, just silence. The next morning, the prisoners looked at each other through the small gaps in their cells. No one spoke, but everyone understood. Something was happening, something bigger than the prison itself. Because outside the war was reaching a turning point, and inside these walls, the prisoners were about to feel it. As the young prisoner sat in the corner of his cell, staring at the cold stone floor, one thought kept returning. Was he just a prisoner of war or something else entirely? Because in this place, the answer to that question could decide everything. And as another set of footsteps echoed down the hallway, slower this time, he looked up. The guard stopped at his door, keys in hand, face unreadable. The lock began to turn, and in that moment, he realized something chilling. This time, it might be his turn. Stay watching, because what happens next will reveal the true fate of Missouri's guerrilla prisoners, and the line between justice and fear will begin to disappear.
The door opened. Chains dragged across the floor as the young prisoner was pulled from his cell. This was it. No explanation, no warning, just movement. The hallway felt longer than before, darker, colder. Every step echoed like a countdown. Other prisoners watched silently through narrow openings in their doors. No one spoke, because everyone understood. When a guard came for you like this, it meant something serious. The prisoner's heart pounded as he was led forward. Then he saw it. Not another cell, not the interrogation room, but a group of officers waiting ahead. One of them stepped forward. "You've been identified," he said calmly. No anger, no shouting, just words that carried weight. Outside the prison, Union forces had been tracking guerrilla fighters for months. Names were collected, witnesses questioned, evidence slowly built. Now it had reached inside the prison. The cause was clear. The war was nearing an end. The action was final decisions. And the consequence? Some prisoners would be released. Some would remain locked away. And some would never leave at all. The prisoner stood still, waiting. The officer continued. "You rode with them. You were part of the raids." The young man didn't deny it. He couldn't. Missouri had forced many into choices they never expected to make. Some joined for belief, some for protection, some because the war left them no other path. The officer paused, then gave the order. "Take him back." The prisoner blinked in confusion. Back? Not forward? Not to punishment? Not to freedom? As the guards turned him around, the chains pulled tight again, and he realized something even more terrifying than before. Not knowing your fate could be worse than knowing it. As the Civil War began to come to an end in 1865, the prisons holding Missouri's guerrilla fighters entered a new phase. The fighting outside slowed, but inside, tension grew. Because now the government had to decide what to do with the men they had captured. These were not simple cases. Guerrilla fighters did not fit cleanly into the laws of war. They were not always recognized as official soldiers, but they had fought. They had risked their lives, and many believed they were defending their side. Others saw them differently, as raiders, outlaws, even terrorists of their time. That made every decision difficult. Inside places like Gratiot Street Prison, officers reviewed cases one by one. Names, reports, witness statements. Each file told a story. Some prisoners had clear records of violence. Others had less evidence against them. And some were caught simply for being connected to the wrong people. The process was slow, and the prisoners felt every moment of it. Days passed with no answers. Weeks followed. The uncertainty became heavy, because no one knew which group they belonged to, the released, the imprisoned, or the condemned. Among the guards, the mood had changed too. The war had taken its toll on everyone. Some guards were tired, others remained strict, but all of them knew one thing. This part of the war was not about battles, it was about decisions. Back inside his young prisoner's cell, he sat quietly. He thought about the past, the rides through open land, the sound of hooves hitting the ground, the feeling of freedom, now replaced by stone walls and iron chains. The contrast was sharp and painful, but he was not alone. Across Missouri, hundreds of men faced the same situation, captured guerrillas waiting for their fate. Some had already been transferred to other prisons, some sent deeper into Union-controlled areas. Others remained where they were, waiting, always waiting. One evening, the prison hallway filled with movement again, but this time it was different. Not just one guard,
Not just one prisoner, multiple doors opened, multiple names were called. The young prisoner stood as he heard voices echoing. He stepped closer to the door, trying to listen. A list was being read. Some names were followed by orders to prepare for transfer, others by orders for release. And then there were names followed by silence. No explanation, just silence. The prisoners understood. Those names meant something final, something that would not be spoken out loud. Fear spread quickly, because now the waiting had an end, but not everyone would like the answer. The next morning, groups of prisoners were lined up in the yard. Guards watched closely, officers moving between them, checking names. One by one, decisions were carried out. Some men were unchained, told they would be released. Their war was over. Others were marched away, sent to different prisons, their punishment not yet finished. And then there were those who were separated from the rest, taken aside. No words, no explanation, just movement. The young prisoner stood still as his name was finally called. For a moment, everything went quiet. The world felt still. He stepped forward, chains clinking softly. The officer looked at him, then down at the paper, then back at him again. A pause, long enough to feel like forever. Then the officer spoke. Transfer. Not freedom, not death, not yet. Relief and fear mixed together, because transfer meant survival, but it also meant the story was not over. As he was led away with a small group of prisoners, he took one last look at the yard, at the walls, at the place that had held him between life and death, and he realized something important. The prison had changed him, the war had changed him, and nothing would ever be the same again. Years later, historians would look back at Missouri during the Civil War and see it as one of the most divided and dangerous places in the country. They would study the actions of guerrilla fighters, the response of Union forces, and the prisons that held these men. Because those prisons told a deeper story, a story about blurred lines between soldier and outlaw, between justice and fear, between survival and consequence. The Missouri guerrilla prisoners were not just part of the war, they were part of its most complicated chapter, a chapter where right and wrong were not always clear, and where every decision carried weight. The young prisoner would leave that prison alive, but the memory would stay with him. The silence, the chains, the waiting, and the moment when his name was called. Because in that moment, his life could have gone in a very different direction, and many others were not as fortunate. Some never walked out, some never saw home again, and their stories remained locked inside those prison walls. But one question still remains. What happens to men who survive a war like that, but can never truly leave it behind? Because for the Missouri guerrilla prisoners, freedom did not always mean peace. And if you think the prison was the end of their story, think again. The train doors slammed shut. Iron wheels groaned as they began to turn. Inside the dark wooden rail car, the prisoners sat in silence, chains still tight around their wrists. No one spoke, no one moved, because they didn't know where they were going. Only one thing was certain: they were leaving Missouri. And for many of them, this journey would decide the rest of their lives. A guard stood near the door, watching closely, rifle ready, eyes sharp, because these were not ordinary prisoners. These were former guerrilla fighters, men who had once moved freely through forests, towns, and battle lines. Now they were being moved like cargo, controlled, watched, and uncertain of what waited at the end of the track. One prisoner whispered, "Where are they taking us?" No answer, just the sound of the train moving forward. The cause was clear. The war had ended. The action was relocation. The consequence, a new chapter of punishment or survival. And as the train rolled deeper into unknown territory, the prisoners realized something chilling. Freedom was still far away. After the Civil War ended in 1865, the United States faced a difficult problem. What should be done with men like these? Missouri's guerrilla fighters had not fought in traditional ways. They had attacked suddenly. They had disappeared quickly. They had created fear across entire regions.
Because of this, many officials did not fully trust them even after the war was over. Some believed these men could return to violence. Others believed they deserved a second chance, but no one could agree easily. So the government made a choice. Many of the captured guerrilla prisoners would not be released immediately. Instead, they were transferred, moved to different military prisons across the country, far from Missouri, far from the places they knew. The young prisoner stepped off the train slowly. His legs felt weak, not from injury, but from time spent in chains and silence. As he looked around, he saw other prisoners, faces tired, eyes cautious, but something else too, a small sign of relief. Because even though they were still prisoners, they were alive. Life inside this new prison was still hard. Food was basic, rules were strict, work was required. But compared to isolation cells, it felt different. There was movement, voices, human connection, and that changed everything. Because surviving prison was not just about strength, it was about holding on to something inside. Hope. Days turned into weeks, weeks followed. The uncertainty became heavy, because no one knew which group they belonged to, the released, the imprisoned, or the condemned.
Slowly, the reality of the war ending began to settle in. No more gunfire in the distance, no more sudden raids, just routine. Wake up, work, eat, wait. Some prisoners began to talk about home, about families they had not seen in years, about places they were not sure still existed the same way. Others stayed quiet, lost in thought, because for them, the war had not ended. It had simply changed. One evening, as the sun lowered behind the prison walls, a rumor spread quickly through the camp. A list was coming, a list of names, men who would be released. At first, no one believed it. Too many false hopes had come and gone. But then, the guards confirmed it. The next day, names would be read, and some prisoners would finally go free. That night, no one slept. Men sat awake, staring into the dark, thinking, remembering, hoping. The young prisoner lay on his bunk, staring at the ceiling. His mind raced. Would his name be called, or would he remain behind? Morning came slowly. The prisoners were gathered outside. Lines formed, guards stood ready. An officer stepped forward with a paper in his hand. The list. Silence fell across the yard. Every breath felt heavy. Then the officer began to read. One name, then another. Each name followed by a man stepping forward. Chains removed, freedom given. Some prisoners smiled. Others looked stunned, as if they couldn't believe it was real. The list continued. The young prisoner listened carefully. Every name felt like a heartbeat, louder, faster, closer. Then it stopped. The officer folded the paper. "Return to your places," he said. That was it. No more names. The young prisoner stood still. His name had not been called, not today. The crowd slowly broke apart. Some men walked away free. Others returned to their barracks. The difference between them was just a name on a page, and that was all it took. Days passed again, but something had changed. The prisoners now understood. Freedom could come at any moment, or not at all, and that uncertainty remained. Over time, more lists came, more names were read. Slowly, the number of prisoners decreased. Men left in small groups, returning to lives they hoped still existed. And one day, it finally happened. The young prisoner heard his name, clear, loud, real. For a moment, he didn't move. Then a guard nodded. Go. The chains were removed. The weight lifted. For the first time in a long time,
He was no longer a prisoner. As he walked out of the prison gates, he didn't look back. Not at the walls, not at the guards, not at the place that had held him for so long. Because some memories are better left behind. But the story of Missouri's guerrilla prisoners does not end with their release, because freedom did not erase the past. Many returned home to places that had changed, communities divided, trust broken, memories of violence still fresh. Some were welcomed back, others were not. Some tried to rebuild their lives, others struggled, because the war had shaped them in ways that could not be undone. Historians would later study these men, trying to understand their role in the Civil War. Were they soldiers, outlaws, or something in between? The answer is not simple, because Missouri itself was not simple during those years. It was a place where lines were blurred, where survival often meant making hard choices, and where the consequences of those choices lasted long after the fighting ended. The prisons that held these men became part of that story, a reminder of how the war reached beyond battlefields, into cells, into chains, into lives that would never be the same again. And even today, the story of Missouri guerrilla prisoners raises a powerful question. When a war divides a nation so deeply, what happens to the people caught in the middle? Because for many of them, the war never truly ended. And if this story made you question what justice really looks like in times of war, you're not alone. The gate closed behind him, not with force, not with fear, but with finality. The young man stood still for a moment, just outside the prison walls. No chains, no guards holding him, no orders being shouted. For the first time in a long time, he was free. But something felt strange. The air felt different. The silence felt louder than the prison, because inside those walls, life was controlled. Outside, everything was uncertain. He took a slow step forward, then another. Each step felt heavier than expected, because freedom is not always easy, especially after living in chains. The war was over. The fighting had stopped, but Missouri was still healing. Houses had been burned. Families had been divided. Neighbors who once trusted each other now looked with doubt. And men like him, former guerrilla fighters, returned to a world that did not know what to do with them. Some people saw them as survivors, others saw them as dangerous, and some saw them as a reminder of a past they wanted to forget. The cause was clear: years of violent conflict. The action was survival at any cost. The consequence, a broken sense of trust that did not disappear overnight. As he walked through a small town, people noticed him, not because of what he wore, but because of what he represented. A man who was part of something dark, something complicated, something the country was still trying to understand. A woman pulled her child closer as he passed. A man standing by a store watched him carefully. No words were spoken, but the message was clear. You were not the same as before. And deep down, he knew it was true. For many former prisoners, returning home was not the ending they imagined. Some found their houses gone. Others found their families had moved away. And some returned to nothing at all. The war had taken more than time. It had taken stability. And now these men had to rebuild from nothing. Some tried to start again. They worked on farms, took small jobs, stayed quiet, hoping to move forward. Others struggled.
because the habits of war were hard to forget. The constant alertness, the need to survive, the fear of being watched. Even in peaceful moments, their minds stayed restless. At night, some could not sleep. The silence felt too unfamiliar, too different from the sounds of prison or the chaos of raids. And in that silence, memories returned. The prison cells, the chains, the waiting, the names being called, and the fear of not hearing your own. Across Missouri, the government also faced a challenge. What to do next? How to rebuild a state that had been so deeply divided. Some officials pushed for peace, others wanted control, and many believed the only way forward was to move on quickly. But moving on is not easy, especially when the past is still close. The prisons that once held guerrilla fighters slowly emptied. Their walls remained, their stories stayed, but the men who lived inside them carried those memories into the outside world, and those memories shaped everything. One evening, as the sun began to set, the young man stood near an open field, the same kind of field he once rode across on horseback, fast, free, without fear. Now he stood still, watching, thinking he could leave Missouri, start fresh somewhere else, forget everything, or at least try to. But something held him back, because no matter where he went,
The past would follow, not as chains, but as memory. And memory can be just as powerful. Years later, people would look back at Missouri during the Civil War and ask questions, difficult questions, about right and wrong, about justice and survival, about the men who fought in ways that did not follow traditional rules. Historians would study figures like William Quantrill and the fighters who followed him, trying to understand their choices, their actions, and their consequences. But the story of Missouri's guerrilla prisoners was never simple, because it was not just about crime, or punishment, or war. It was about people. People placed in impossible situations. People forced to choose sides. People who lived with the results of those choices long after the war ended. As time passed, the young man built a quiet life. Nothing grand, nothing famous, just simple. Working, living, trying to move forward. But every now and then, something would remind him. A sound, a place, a memory. And in those moments, he would remember the prison, the darkness, the waiting, and the day his name was called. Because that moment had changed everything. The story of Missouri guerrilla prisoners is not just a story of war. It is a story of what happens after the fighting ends, after the prison doors open, after the chains are removed. Because that is when the real challenge begins. Learning how to live again in a world that has changed and in a mind that has changed with it. And even today, one question still remains. When the war ends, do the people who live through it ever truly leave it behind? Or does a part of it stay with them forever? Because for many of Missouri's guerrilla prisoners, freedom was real, but peace was something they had to fight for all over again. And if you've made it this far, you've just uncovered one of the most complex true crime prison stories in American history. The sound came back. Not the sound of chains, not the sound of prison doors, but something quieter. A distant hoofbeat, soft at first, then clearer. The young man froze. For a moment, it felt like the past had returned, like the war had come back for him. His heart began to race. His eyes scanned the road ahead. Because in Missouri, even after the war, danger didn't always disappear. Sometimes it waited. The years after the Civil War were not peaceful for everyone. Missouri remained tense. The fighting had stopped, but the anger had not. Some former guerrilla fighters tried to rebuild their lives. Others could not, because they had learned to survive in a world of conflict. And when that world ended, they were left searching for purpose. The cause was clear. War had shaped them. The action was survival through violence and fear. The consequence, a struggle to return to normal life. Some men turned away from the past. They worked hard, stayed quiet, avoided trouble. They wanted nothing more than peace. But others followed a different path. The habits of guerrilla warfare, fast movement, sudden action, distrust did not fade easily. And for a few, those habits became something else. Outlaw behavior, robbery, violence. Not because the war continued, but because it had never fully left them. Across the state, stories began to spread. Train robberies, bank thefts, small groups of armed men moving quickly, then disappearing. To some people, these men looked like criminals. To others, they looked like something familiar, because the way they operated felt the same. Fast, unexpected, hard to stop, just like the Bushwhackers during the war. Among the names people whispered about were men connected to old guerrilla groups. Some had once ridden under leaders like William Quantrill. Now, years later, their lives had taken a different turn, but the connection to the past remained. The government noticed. Law enforcement became more active because they feared something important, that the skills learned during the war could now be used in new ways, and that meant the danger had not fully ended. The young man stood still, watching as a rider passed by on the road. Just a traveler, nothing more. But the feeling stayed, that sense of alertness, that need to be ready, even when there was no clear threat. Because once you live in a world where danger can appear at any moment, it is hard to stop expecting it. He took a deep breath, trying to calm himself, trying to remind himself the war was over. But his mind did not fully believe it. In towns across Missouri, people struggled with trust. They remembered who supported which side. They remembered who fought and how they had fought. That memory did not fade quickly, because the war had not been far away. It had been close, personal. Neighbors had taken different sides, families had been divided, and now those same people had to live side by side again. Some communities tried to heal. They focused on rebuilding, on moving forward, but others held on to the past. Suspicion remained, and men who had once been guerrilla fighters often felt that weight, because no matter what they did after the war, they were still seen as who they had been. The prisons that once held these men became quieter over time, their cells empty, their doors closed, but their purpose did not disappear from memory. Because those prisons represented something important. They showed how far the country had gone to control the violence and how difficult it was to define justice in a time like that. Some historians would later argue that guerrilla prisoners were treated too harshly. Others believed the government had no choice because the war in Missouri was different, more unpredictable, more personal, more dangerous in ways that were hard to control. One evening, the young man stood outside, looking at the horizon. The sun was setting slowly, the sky calm, peaceful. It should have felt like the end of something, but instead, it felt like a question. What comes next? Because surviving the war and the prison was only part of the journey. Now came something harder, living with it, understanding it, finding a way to move forward. Years passed. Life slowly became more stable. The state rebuilt. Towns grew again. People focused on the future. But the stories remained. Stories of raids, of prisons, of men who lived on both sides of the line between soldier and outlaw. And those stories became part of American history, not just as events, but as lessons about what happens when a nation is divided, about how conflict changes people, and about the long shadow that war can leave behind. The young man stood up. The road in front of him was quiet, open. For the first time in a long while, he felt something different. Not fear, not uncertainty, but a small sense of control. Because even though the past could not be changed, the future was still unwritten, and that mattered. The story of Missouri guerrilla prisoners is not just a story of war. It is a story of what happens after the fighting ends, after the prison doors open, after the chains are removed.
because that is when the real challenge begins. Learning how to live again in a world that has changed and in a mind that has changed with it. And even today, one question still remains. When the war ends, do the people who live through it ever truly leave it behind? Or does a part of it stay with them forever? Because for many of Missouri's guerrilla prisoners, freedom was real, but peace was something they had to fight for all over again.
And if you've made it this far, you've just uncovered one of the most complex true crime prison stories in American history. The sound came back. Not the sound of chains, not the sound of prison doors, but something quieter. A distant hoofbeat. Soft at first, then clearer. The young man froze. For a moment, it felt like the past had returned, like the war had come back for him. His heart began to race. His eyes scanned the road ahead, because in Missouri, even after the war, danger didn't always disappear. Sometimes it waited. The years after the Civil War were not peaceful for everyone. Missouri remained tense. The fighting had stopped, but the anger had not. Some former guerrilla fighters tried to rebuild their lives. Others could not, because they had learned to survive in a world of conflict, and when that world ended, they were left searching for purpose. The cause was clear. War had shaped them. The action was survival through violence and fear. The consequence? A struggle to return to normal life. Some men turned away from the past. They worked hard, stayed quiet, avoided trouble. They wanted nothing more than peace. But others followed a different path. The habits of guerrilla warfare, fast movement, sudden action, distrust, did not fade easily. And for a few, those habits became something else. Outlaw behavior, robbery, violence. Not because the war continued, but because it had never fully left them. Across the state, stories began to spread. Train robberies, bank thefts, small groups of armed men moving quickly, then disappearing. To some people, these men looked like criminals. To others, they looked like something familiar, because the way they operated felt the same. Fast, unexpected, hard to stop, just like the Bushwhackers during the war. Among the names people whispered about were men connected to old guerrilla groups. Some had once ridden under leaders like William Quantrill. Now, years later, their lives had taken a different turn, but the connection to the past remained. The government noticed. Law enforcement became more active because they feared something important, that the skills learned during the war could now be used in new ways, and that meant the danger had not fully ended. The young man stood still, watching as a rider passed by on the road. Just a traveler, nothing more. But the feeling stayed, that sense of alertness, that need to be ready, even when there was no clear threat. Because once you live in a world where danger can appear at any moment, it is hard to stop expecting it. He took a deep breath, trying to calm himself, trying to remind himself the war was over. But his mind did not fully believe it. In towns across Missouri, people struggled with trust. They remembered who supported which side. They remembered who fought and how they fought. That memory did not fade quickly, because the war had not been far away. It had been close, personal. Neighbors had taken different sides, families had been divided, and now those same people had to live side by side again. Some communities tried to heal. They focused on rebuilding, on moving forward, but others held on to the past. Suspicion remained, and men who had once been guerrilla fighters often felt that weight, because no matter what they did after the war, they were still seen as who they had been. The prisons that once held these men became quieter over time, their cells empty, their doors closed, but their purpose did not disappear from memory. Because those prisons represented something important. They showed how far the country had gone to control the violence, and how difficult it was to define justice in a time like that. Some historians would later argue that guerrilla prisoners were treated too harshly. Others believed the government had no choice, because the war in Missouri had been different, more unpredictable, more personal, more dangerous in ways that were hard to control. One evening, the young man sat outside, looking at the horizon. The sun was setting slowly, the sky calm, peaceful. It should have felt like the end of something, but instead, it felt like a question. What comes next? Because surviving the war and the prison was only part of the journey. Now came something harder, living with it, understanding it, finding a way to move forward. Years passed. Life slowly became more stable. The state rebuilt. Towns grew again. People focused on the future. But the stories remained. Stories of raids, of prisons, of men who lived on both sides of the line between soldier and outlaw. And those stories became part of American history, not just as events, but as lessons about what happens when a nation is divided, about how conflict changes people, and about the long shadow that war can leave behind. The young man stood up. The road in front of him was quiet, open. For the first time in a long while, he felt something different. Not fear, not uncertainty, but a small sense of control. Because even though the past could not be changed, the future was still unwritten. And that mattered. The story of Missouri guerrilla prisoners is not just about what happened inside prison. It is about what followed, the choices made after, the lives rebuilt or lost, and the question that still remains today. When people are shaped by war, can they ever truly return to who they were before? Or do they carry that past with them? And as the light faded into night, one truth became clear. The prison had ended. The war had ended. But the story was still being written.
And if you think this is where it all ends, the final truth might surprise you. The knock came at night. Not loud, not rushed, just 3 slow taps on the wooden door. The young man froze. No one visited at this hour. No one knocked like that unless it meant something serious. For a moment, it felt like the prison had followed him home, like the guards had returned, like the past was knocking again. He stood still, listening. The knock came again, 3 slow taps. He stepped forward carefully and opened the door. A man stood there, face shadowed, eyes cautious. No uniform, no badge, but something about him felt familiar. "You used to ride," the man said quietly. The words hung in the air. The past had found him. Even after the war had ended, the network of former guerrilla fighters did not disappear completely. Some men stayed in contact, not openly, not loudly, but quietly, through whispers, through messages, through visits like this. Because shared experiences create strong bonds, and the men who had lived through the raids, the prisons, and the fear of capture understood each other in ways others could not. The cause was simple. Survival had once depended on trust. The action was staying connected. The consequence, a past that refused to stay buried. The man at the door stepped inside. He looked around quickly as if checking for danger. Then he spoke again. "Things are changing," he said. "What kind of things?" the young man asked. The visitor paused. "Men are gathering again." The words felt heavy. Not war, not exactly, but something close. Because even without a war, conflict can grow in different ways. Across Missouri and nearby states, small groups of former fighters began to appear again, not as armies, not under official flags, but as loose groups. Some claimed they were protecting themselves. Others had different goals: money, power, control. The line between survival and crime became thin again, because the skills learned during the war did not disappear. They were still there, riding fast, planning quietly, striking suddenly, and vanishing before anyone could stop them. To some, it looked like the return of bushwhackers. To others, it looked like something new: outlaws. The government noticed the change. Law enforcement became more alert because they had seen this before. They knew how quickly small groups could become dangerous, especially when those groups were made up of men who had already lived through war. The prisons that once held these men were now empty, but the lessons from those prisons remained: control, containment, prevention. Because officials understood something important: stopping violence after it begins is hard. Stopping it before it begins is even harder. Back inside the small house, the young man listened carefully. The visitor leaned closer. "We could use someone like you," he said. The room felt smaller, the air heavier, because this was the moment, a choice. The cause was the past calling him back. The action would be his decision, and the consequence, that would shape everything. The young man looked down at his hands. No chains, no marks, but he could still feel the weight of them. The prison had left something behind: a memory, a warning, a line he did not want to cross again. "I'm done with that life," he said quietly. The visitor watched him for a moment, then nodded slowly. "Not everyone is." And with that, he turned and walked out into the night. The door closed. Silence returned. But the message stayed. The past was not gone. It was still moving, still changing, still affecting lives. In the years that followed, Missouri saw the rise of outlaw groups made up of former fighters. Some became known for robberies, train heists, bank thefts. They used speed, planning, and the same tactics that had once made them effective during the war. Historians would later connect some of these groups to former guerrilla networks. Not all, but enough to see a pattern. Because war does not just end. It leaves behind knowledge, experience, and sometimes a way of living that is hard to leave behind. For those who chose a different path, life slowly became more stable. They worked, built families, created new routines. But even for them, the memories remained. The prison, the waiting, the fear of hearing your name called or not called at all. Those moments stayed, quiet but powerful. The young man stepped outside and looked at the night sky. Stars stretched across the darkness, calm, still, nothing like the nights he remembered. No fireground, no shouting, just silence, real silence. And for the first time, he felt something settle inside him. Not completely, not perfectly, but enough to understand something important. The war had shaped him, the prison had tested him, but the future, that was still his to choose. The story of Missouri guerrilla prisoners does not end with prison walls or battlefield memories. It continues in the choices made after, in the paths taken, in the decisions to return or to move forward. Because every man who walked out of those prisons faced the same question: what kind of life comes next? And not all answers were the same. As time moved on, the country itself began to heal. Slowly, carefully. The divisions did not disappear overnight, but they became less sharp, less immediate.
History began to take shape, and the stories of places like Missouri became part of a larger understanding of how complex the Civil War truly was, of how it affected not just armies, but individuals, communities, lives. And even today, when people look back at the story of Missouri guerrilla prisoners, one truth stands out. The prison was only part of the story. The real story was what came after. The choices, the struggles, the effort to live beyond the past. The young man turned back toward his home. The door closed quietly behind him. No chains, no guards, no orders. Just a life waiting to be lived. But one question still remains. When the past knocks on your door, do you answer it or do you walk away? And if you think the past stays buried, history says otherwise. The prison stood empty. No chains, no voices, no guards shouting orders down the hallway. Just silence. The same walls that once held Missouri's most feared guerrilla prisoners now stood still, like they were holding memories instead of men. The young man stepped slowly toward the old building. He had not planned to come back, but something pulled him there, something unfinished. The wind moved softly through broken wood and stone. For a moment, it felt like time had stopped, like the past was still waiting inside. And as he stepped closer, he realized something chilling. Some places never truly let go of what happened inside them. Years had passed since the Civil War ended. Missouri had changed. The roads were quieter. The towns were rebuilding. Families were trying to move forward. But history does not disappear. It stays in places, in stories, in people. And this prison was one of those places. Once, it had held men accused of raids, ambushes, and acts of terror. Men called Bushwhackers, men who lived on the edge between soldier and outlaw. Inside these walls, decisions had been made. Who would be held, who would be released, and who would never walk free again. Now, it stood empty, but not forgotten. The young man stepped inside. The door creaked softly. Dust filled the air. The light barely reached the corners. He walked slowly down the hallway. Each step echoed, just like before. And with every step, memories returned. The sound of chains, the voices of guards, the silence of waiting. Because this place had once controlled everything. Time, movement, hope. He stopped in front of a cell, his cell. The door was open now, no lock, no chains. He stepped inside. The room felt smaller than he remembered, or maybe he had changed. He ran his hand along the cold wall, and for a moment, he could feel it again. The fear, the uncertainty, the question that never left. Would he walk out of this place alive? The cause of everything that happened here was war, a war that divided people, a war that forced choices. The action was conflict, guerrilla attacks, raids, retaliation, and the consequence, places like this prison, where the lines between justice and punishment became unclear. Because not every prisoner had the same story. Not every man inside these walls was the same. Some believed in what they fought for. Some were pulled into it. Some had no way out. And yet, they were all treated as part of the same problem. The young man sat down on the floor of the empty cell, the same place where he once waited for answers, for decisions, for his name to be called. Now, there was no waiting, only reflection. Because time had given him something he did not have before: distance, understanding. He looked around the cell one last time, then stood up slowly, because he knew something important. This place was part of his story, but it was not the end of it. Across the country, historians would later study prisons like this one, trying to understand how the United States handled guerrilla warfare during the Civil War. They would study men like William Quantrill and the fighters who followed him. They would ask difficult questions. Were these men soldiers, criminals, or something in between? The answer would never be simple,
because Missouri itself had never been simple during those years. The young man stepped back into the hallway. The light from outside was stronger now, brighter, clearer. He walked toward it slowly, each step taking him further from the past, further from the place that once defined his fate. As he reached the doorway, he stopped, just for a moment. He turned back, looked at the empty hallway, the open cells, the silence, and he understood something deeply. The prison was real. The fear was real. The choices were real. But they were no longer controlling him. Outside, the world continued. People moved forward.
Time did not stop, and neither could he. He stepped into the light. The door behind him moved slightly with the wind, then settled, quiet again. The story of Missouri guerrilla prisoners is not just about what happened during the war. It is about what remained after. The memories, the questions, the impact on lives that continued long after the fighting ended. Because war does not end when the last battle is fought. It ends slowly, in people, in places, in moments like this. And even today, the story still matters because it shows something important: how conflict can change ordinary people, how fear can shape decisions, and how difficult it can be to define justice when everything is uncertain. The young man walked away from the prison without looking back this time, not because he forgot, but because he understood. The past was part of him, but it did not have to control his future. And as the sun set behind him, one final thought remained. What happens to the places that hold history when the people who lived it finally move on? Because sometimes the walls remember everything. And if this story made you see history differently, then you've just uncovered something most people never notice. The prison doors opened, but the story didn't end there. The past followed them long after the war was over. If you want more real U.S. crime stories that history tried to hide, subscribe now and don't miss what's coming next.